USS Portland, CA-33, was among a force of 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers under Daniel J. Callaghan on the night of 12 November 1942, which steamed to counter an approaching Japanese force. They spotted a Japanese force of 2 battleships, 1 cruiser and 11 destroyers, and immediately opened fire, sinking the Japanese destroyer Akatsuki. Shortly thereafter, Portland was struck by a torpedo fired by either the destroyer Inazuma or the destroyer Ikazuchi at 0158, causing heavy damage to her stern. The torpedo struck the starboard side, which blew off both inboard propellers, jammed the rudder 5 degrees to starboard, and jammed her number 3 turret in train and elevation. A 4-degree list was quickly corrected by shifting ballast, but the steering problem could not be overcome, and the ship was forced to steam in circles to starboard. The blast disrupted her steering column, forcing her to steer in a circle. At the end of her first circle, she fired on the battleship Hiei with her forward turrets. The Japanese ship returned fire, but all salvos passed over the cruiser. In the 4 6-gun salvos returned by Portland, she succeeded in starting fires in the Japanese ship. At dawn, she was one of 3 U.S. ships still too damaged to withdraw on her own power. Then again at 0630, still circling, Portland opened fire on the abandoned hulk of the destroyer Udachi at a range of 6 miles. After the 6th salvo, Udachi exploded, rolled over, and sank within 5 minutes. Portland was eventually able to correct the steering problem and withdraw on her own. She suffered 18 killed, 17 wounded in the battle. After 6 months of stateside repairs, Portland rejoined the fleet in early June 1943. She would earn 16 battle stars for her service in WWII and was sold for scrap in 1959. USS Astoria, CA-34, on the morning of 7 August 1942, entered the waters between Guadalcanal and Florida Islands in the Southern Solomons. Throughout the day, she supported the Marines as they landed on Guadalcanal and several smaller islands nearby. The Japanese launched air counterattacks on the 7th, 8th, and Astoria helped to defend the transports from those attacks. On the night of 8-9 Aug, a Japanese force of 7 cruisers and a destroyer under Vice Admiral Gunishi Mikawa snuck by Savo Island and attacked the American ships. At the time, Astoria had been patrolling to the east of Savo Island in column behind Vincennes and Quincy. The Japanese came through the channel to the west of Savo Island and opened fire. The Japanese then divided into 2 separate groups and turned northeast, passing on either side of Astoria and her 2 consorts. The enemy cruisers began firing on that force at about 1:50, and the Astoria began returning fire immediately. She ceased fire briefly because her commanding officer temporarily mistook the Japanese force for friendly ships but soon resumed shooting. Astoria took no hits in the first 4 Japanese salvos, but the 5th ripped into her superstructure, turning her into an inferno amidships. In quick succession, enemy shells put her number 1 turret out of action and started a serious fire in the plane hangar that burned brightly and provided the enemy with a self-illuminated target. From that moment on, deadly accurate Japanese gunfire pounded her unmercifully, and she began to lose speed. Turning to the right to avoid Quincy's fire at about 2:01, Astoria reeled as a succession of enemy shells struck her aft of the foremast. Soon thereafter, Quincy veered across Astoria's bow, blazing fiercely from bow to stern. Astoria put her rudder over hard left and avoided a collision while her battered sister ship passed aft, to starboard. As the warship turned, Kinugasa's searchlight illuminated her, and men on deck passed the order to number 2 turret to shoot out the offending light. When the turret responded with Astoria's 12th and final salvo, the shells missed Kinugasa but struck the number 1 turret of Chakai. Astoria lost steering control on the bridge at about 0225, shifted control to Central Station, and began steering a zigzag course south. Before she made much progress, though, the heavy cruiser lost all power. Fortunately, the Japanese chose that exact instant to withdraw. By 03, 00, nearly 400 men, including about 70 wounded and many dead, were assembled on the forecastle deck. Suffering from the effects of at least 65 hits, Astoria fought for her life. A bucket brigade battled the blaze on the gun deck and the starboard passage forward from that deck, and the wounded were moved to the captain's cabin, where doctors and corpsmen proceeded with their care. Eventually, however, the deck beneath grew hot and forced the wounded back to the forecastle. Bagley came alongside Astoria's starboard bow, and by 4:45, took all of the wounded off the heavy cruiser's forecastle. Since it appeared that the ship could be saved, a salvage crew of about 325 able-bodied men went back aboard Astoria. Another bucket brigade attacked the fires, while the ship's first lieutenant investigated all accessible lower decks. A party of men collected the dead and prepared them for burial. Nevertheless, the fire below decks increased steadily in intensity, and those topside could hear explosions. Her list increased, first to 10 degrees and then 15 degrees. Her stern lowered in the dark waters, and her bow was distinctively rising. All attempts to shore the shell holes, by then below the waterline due to the increasing list, proved ineffective, and the list increased still more. With the port waterway awash at noon, Commodore William G. Greenman gave the order to abandon ship. Astoria turned over on her port beam, rolled slowly, and settled by the stern, disappearing completely by 12:16. Not one man from the salvage crew lost his life. Officially, 219 men were reported missing or killed. USS Indianapolis, CA-35, was operating off Okinawa on 31 March 1945, when Indianapolis lookouts spotted a Japanese Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighter as it emerged from the morning twilight and dived vertically towards the bridge. The ship's 20 guns opened fire, but within 15 seconds the plane was over the ship. Tracers converged on it, causing it to swerve, but the pilot managed to release his bomb from a height of 25 ft, then crashing his plane into the sea near the port stern. The bomb plummeted through the deck, into the crew's mess hall, down through the berthing compartment, and through the fuel tanks before crashing through the keel and exploding in the water underneath. The concussion blew 2 gaping holes in the keel which flooded nearby compartments, killing 9 crewmen. The ship's bulkheads prevented any progressive flooding. Indianapolis, settling slightly by the stern and listing to port, steamed to a salvage ship for emergency repairs. Here, inspection revealed that her propeller shafts were damaged, her fuel tanks ruptured, and her water distilling equipment ruined. But Indianapolis commenced the long trip across the Pacific, under her own power, to the Mare Island Navy Yard for repairs. After major repairs and an overhaul, Indianapolis received orders to undertake a top-secret mission, to deliver enriched uranium and other important components of the little boy atomic device. After leaving San Francisco on 16 July, she arrived at Tinian Island on 26 July. After leaving Tinian, the ship stopped at Guam, where a number of her crew who had completed their tour of duty were relieved by other sailors. The ship left Guam headed for Leyte on 28 July 1945. At 00:15 on 30 July, Indianapolis was struck on her starboard side by 2 Type 95 torpedoes, one in the bow and one amidships, from the Japanese submarine I-58. The explosions caused massive damage. Indianapolis quickly took on a heavy list and settled by the bow. 12 minutes later, she rolled completely over, then her stern rose into the air and she sank. Some 300 of the 1,195 crewmen aboard went down with the ship. Many of the survivors were wounded, and all suffered from lack of food and water. Exposure to the elements, dehydration from the hot sun during the day and hypothermia at night, as well as severe desquamation due to exposure to oily salt water, and frequent shark attacks slowly whittled down the survivors. Some killed themselves or other survivors in various states of delirium and hallucinations. Navy Command did not know of the ship sinking until survivors were spotted in the open ocean 3.5 days later. Only 316 of the nearly 900 men set adrift after the sinking survived. 2 more crewmen would die of their wounds. USS Minneapolis, CA-36, was sailing on 30 November 1942 as flagship of TF-67, which consisted of Fletcher, Perkins, Maury, Drayton, Minneapolis, New Orleans, Pensacola, Honolulu, Northampton, Lamson, and Ladner, to intercept a Japanese task force consisting of 8 destroyers, 6 of them carrying drums full of supplies in a midnight attempt to reinforce and resupply Guadalcanal. At 23:21, Minneapolis opened fire on the destroyer Takanami, which quickly sank after several hits. At 23:27, after firing her 9th salvo, Minneapolis took 2 torpedo hits. One of the warheads hit her port side, exploding the aviation fuel storage tanks forward of turret 1 and folding the bow down to over 70 degrees. The second torpedo hit portside aft and knocked out 3 of the ship's 4 fire rooms, opening 2 of them to the sea. 37 of her crew were lost. The ship was saved by skillful damage control work and was able to reach Chalagi, where she was temporarily repaired by her own crew. From August 1943, Minneapolis would go on to serve in every major American operation in the Pacific save Iwo Jima. For her service in WWII, she was awarded 16 battle stars. USS San Francisco, CA-38, was protecting unloading transports near Lunga Point, Guadalcanal on 12 November 1942, when a group of Japanese torpedo bombers attacked at 14:08. At 14:16, an already damaged torpedo bomber dropped its torpedo off San Francisco's starboard quarter. The torpedo passed alongside, but the plane crashed into San Francisco's control aft, swung around that structure and plunged over the port side into the sea. 16 men were killed and 29 wounded. Control aft was demolished. The ship's secondary command post, Battle 2, was burned out but was re-established by dark. The after anti-aircraft director and radar were put out of commission. 320 mounts were destroyed. At about midnight on 13 November 1942, San Francisco, in company with heavy cruiser USS Portland, the light cruisers Atlanta, Helena, and Juno, and 8 destroyers, entered Lengo Channel. At 1:25, a Japanese naval force was discovered about 27,000 wide to the northwest. Rear Admiral Callaghan's task group maneuvered to intercept in what became the first engagement in the naval battle of Guadalcanal. At 1:48, in almost pitch darkness, San Francisco opened fire on an enemy cruiser 3,700 wide off her starboard beam. At 01:51, she trained her guns on a small cruiser or large destroyer 3,300 wide off her starboard bow. Then, in an attempt to locate other targets, San Francisco accidentally targeted Atlanta. San Francisco's gunfire caused extensive damage to Atlanta, killing Admiral Scott and most of Atlanta's bridge crew. At about 200, San Francisco trained her guns on Kirishima. At the same time, she became the target of Nagara off her starboard bow and of a destroyer that had crossed her bow and was passing down her port side. The enemy battleship joined the cruiser and the destroyer in firing on San Francisco, whose port 5 in battery engaged the destroyer but was put out of action except for one mount. The battleship put the starboard 5 in battery out of commission. San Francisco swung left while her main battery continued to fire on the battleships which, with the cruiser and the destroyer, continued to pound San Francisco. A direct hit on the navigation bridge killed or badly wounded all officers, except for the communications officer. Steering and engine control were lost and shifted to Battle 2, which was soon also knocked out, was out of commission by a direct hit from the port side. Control was again lost. Control was re-established in the conning tower, which soon received a hit from the starboard side. Steering and engine control were temporarily lost, then regained. All communications were now dead. Soon thereafter, the enemy ceased firing. San Francisco followed suit and withdrew eastward along the north coast of Guadalcanal. 77 sailors, including Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callaghan and Captain Casson Young, had been killed, and 105 wounded in the night's action. The ship had taken 45 hits. Structural damage was extensive, but not fatal. No hits had been received below the waterline. 22 fires had been started and extinguished. The ship reached San Francisco for repairs on 11 December 1942. She would return to the Pacific by 26 February 1943. San Francisco was one of the Navy's most decorated ships, being awarded 17 battle stars for her service. She was scrapped in 1961. USS Quincy, CA-39, while on patrol in the channel between Florida Island and Savo Island. In the early hours of 9 August, Quincy was attacked by a large Japanese naval force during the Battle of Savo Island. Quincy had seen aircraft flares dropped over other ships in the task force, and had just sounded general quarters and was coming alert when the searchlights from the Japanese column came on. Quincy's captain, Samuel N. Moore, gave the order to commence firing, but the gun crews were not ready. Within a few minutes, Quincy was caught in a crossfire between Yaba, Furutaka, and Tenryu, and was hit heavily and set afire. Quincy's captain ordered his cruiser to charge towards the eastern Japanese column, but as she turned to do so, Quincy was hit by 2 torpedoes from Tenryu, causing severe damage. Quincy managed to fire a few main gun salvos, one of which hit Chakai's chart room 20 FT from Admiral Mikawa and killed or wounded 36 men, although Mikawa was not injured. At 02:10, incoming shells killed or wounded almost all of Quincy's bridge crew, including the captain. At 02:16, the cruiser was hit by a torpedo from Yaba, and the ship's remaining guns were silenced. Quincy sustained many direct hits which left 370 men dead and 167 wounded. She sank bow first at 02:38, being the first ship sunk in the area which was later known as Iron Bottom Sound. USS Vincennes, CA-44, was patrolling as a screen off Savo Island for unloading transport ships on the night of 9 August 1942, when at about 1:45, lookouts spotted flares and star shells to the southward, accompanied by the low rumble of gunfire. The sound of the general quarters alarm soon rang throughout the ship and stirred her to action. Unbeknownst to the men manning the ships to the northward, a powerful enemy force was heading in their direction. The first Japanese cruiser searchlight beams illuminated Vincennes shortly after 1:55, and the American cruiser opened fire with her main battery at the troublesome lights. Within a minute, however, Japanese shells bracketed the ship and Vincennes shuddered under the impact of Japanese 8-inch armor-piercing shells. The bridge, carpenter shop, battle II, and radio antenna trunks all were hit by the first salvo. The ship reeled under the impact of a second salvo of direct hits which set fire to the volatile aircraft in Vincennes' hangar space, and the resultant flames became uncontrollable. A direct hit knocked the aft anti-aircraft director overboard. At 02:00, Vincennes heeled to starboard in an attempt to evade enemy gunfire, only to be hit by Japanese torpedoes. 1 or 2 Long Lance torpedoes ripped into the ship's No. 4 fire room and put it out of action. In moments the report came, both engine rooms are black and dead. At 2:10, the Japanese retired, leaving Savo Island and the burning hulks of 3 American cruisers in their wakes. As Vincennes' list increased to port, the order to abandon ship was given at 2:30. Serviceable life jackets and rafts were broken out, and the crew began abandoning ship. 332 of her men would go down with her as she rolled over and sank 2.5 miles east of Savo Island at 02:50. USS Canberra, CA-70, joined TF-38 in October 1944, which was tasked with performing air raids on Okinawa and Taiwan in preparation for the landings at Leyte. On 13 October 1944, an airdrop torpedo from a Japanese aircraft hit the cruiser below her armor belt. The explosion killed 23 personnel and exposed the engineering spaces to the ocean, stalling the ship. The ship was docked for repairs from February until October 1945. Light cruiser CL USS Raleigh CL-7 was moored on the west side of Ford Island when the Japanese made their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. In the first attack wave, a torpedo passed ahead and a second hit Raleigh portside amidships. The cruiser took such a list to port that it appeared she might capsize. As crew jettisoned topside weight to keep her upright, her gunners helped to destroy 5 Japanese planes. Several of her crew were wounded, but none were killed. USS Concord, CL-10, was on a tour to survey the potential use of a number of Southeast Pacific islands in national defense and commercial aviation when during this cruise, she suffered a gasoline explosion that killed 24 men including her executive officer, and caused considerable damage, which was repaired at Balboa, Panama. USS Marblehead, CL-12, was attempting to intercept a Japanese invasion convoy in the Makassar Strait on 4 February 1942 when her task force was attacked by 60 Japanese bombers. Marblehead successfully maneuvered through 3 attacks. After the third, an enemy plane spiraled toward the cruiser, but her gunners splashed it. The next minute, a fourth wave of 7 bombers released bombs at Marblehead. 2 were direct hits, and a third, a near-miss close aboard the port bow, causing severe underwater damage. Fires swept the ship as she listed to starboard and began to settle by the bow. Her rudder jammed, Marblehead continuing to steam at full speed, circled to port. Her gunners kept firing, while damage control crews fought the fires and helped the wounded. By 1100, the fires were under control. Before noon, the enemy planes departed, leaving the damaged cruiser with 15 dead or mortally wounded and 84 seriously injured. Marblehead underwent extensive repairs before being sent to the Atlantic Theater for the rest of the war. USS Savannah, CL-42, was providing gun support for U.S. troops attacking Salerno Bay as a part of Operation Avalanche on 11 September 1943, when her task force came under assault from the German Luftwaffe unit KG-100. Savannah was hit by a Fritz X radio-guided bomb at 10:00. The bomb pierced the roof of Turret 3, passed through 3 decks into the lower ammunition handling room, where it exploded, blowing a hole in her keel and tearing a seam in the cruiser's port side. For at least 30 minutes, secondary explosions in the turret and its ammunition supply rooms hampered firefighting efforts. Savannah's crew quickly sealed off flooded and burned compartments and corrected her list. With assistance from the salvage tugs Hopi and Morno, Savannah got underway under her own steam by 17:57 hours and steamed for Malta. She lost 175 crewmen from the attack, and ship would be out of action for 10 months. USS Nashville, CL-43, was shelling Vila Airfield on Kolombangara when on the night of 12 May, she suffered a powder charge explosion in one of her forward turrets, killing 18 and injuring 17. She returned to the States for 2 months of repairs and modernization. On 13 December 1944, she was struck by a kamikaze off Negros Island at 14:15. The plane smashed into the ship's port main deck waist. Both of its bombs went off on the deck, and gasoline fires engulfed the area near the crash. Ammunition for 5 40 and 20 cooked off, causing more casualties. In this attack, 135 men were killed and another 190 wounded. The ship would be sold to the Chilean Navy and would serve until 1985. USS Boise, CL-47, was with the task force which on the night of 11-12 October 1942 encountered a force of Japanese cruisers and destroyers to the west of Guadalcanal. In the engagement now known as the Battle of Cape Esperance, Boise was hit a number of times, twice by fire from a Japanese heavy cruiser from about 7,500 yards range. One hit exploded upon impact on her armor, causing little damage. The other exploded in the 6-inch magazine located between number I and II turrets, causing a powder fire and flooding, putting turrets II, and III out of action, and causing a number of casualties, including 107 killed. Boise would be repaired and returned to a lengthy service with the Navy during WWII. The ship would be sold to the Argentine Navy and eventually made its way back to the U.S. and finally Japan, ironically, for scrapping in 1978. USS Honolulu, CL-48, was damaged by a near-miss bomb during the attack on Pearl Harbor, requiring repairs. The ship suffered no casualties during the raid. While operating as part of TF-67 off Kolombangara Island on 13 July 1943 shortly after midnight, contact was made with an enemy cruiser-destroyer force. At 1:10, Honolulu opened fire on a Sendai-class cruiser. After 3 salvos, the target burst into flame and was soon dead in the water. Honolulu shifted fire to an enemy destroyer, which was immediately hit and disappeared. At 2:11, a torpedo struck the starboard side of Honolulu, blowing off her bow. Luckily, the ship suffered no casualties during the battle. The task force then retired to Tulagi for temporary repairs, and then departed for the large naval base at Pearl Harbor. On 16 August, Honolulu arrived at Pearl Harbor for major repairs and a new bow. She then proceeded to the shipyard at Mare Island, near San Francisco, for more work. On 20 October 1944, she was screening the invasion force of Leyte when she was attacked by a Japanese torpedo bomber. She was hit on the port side, and once again suffered damage that required a return to the U.S. for repairs. After the war, Honolulu would be mothballed and sold for scrap in 1959. USS St. Louis, CL-49, engaged an enemy force on 12 July 1942, consisting of the Japanese cruiser Jinsu and 5 destroyers in the Battle of Kolombangara. During the battle, which raged for over an hour, St. Louis was hit by a torpedo that twisted her bow but caused no serious casualties. The ship would be out of action until November 1942. On 13 January 1944, she arrived in the area between Buka and St. George Channel to support landing operations in the Green Islands, off of New Ireland. On the 14th, at 1945, her group was attacked by 6 D-3A Val dive bombers. 2 of the planes closed on St. Louis. The first plane missed with all 3 bombs. The second plane scored a hit on the light cruiser. The bomb that hit penetrated the foremast clipping room near the No. 6 gun mount and exploded in the midships living compartment. 23 died and 20 were wounded. Repairs were completed by the end of the month, and in March, St. Louis resumed operations with her division. On 29 November 1944, St. Louis was operating in Leyte Gulf when she was attacked by several kamikazes. A D-4Y dove on St. Louis from the port quarter and exploded with its bomb on impact. Fires broke out in the cruiser's hangar area and spaces. All crew members of 20 guns 710 were killed or wounded. At 11:46, there was still no CAP cover over the cruiser's formation, and at 11:51, 2 more enemy planes, both burning, attacked St. Louis. The first was splashed off the port quarter, and the second drove in from starboard and crashed almost on board on the port side. A 20 FT section of armor belt was lost and numerous holes were torn in her hull. By 11:52, the ship had taken on a list to port. At 12:10, another kamikaze closed on St. Louis but was shot down less than 400 yards away. 16 men were lost on St. Louis and 43 wounded. By 12:36, the cruiser was back on an even keel. 30 minutes later, all major fires were out, and salvage work had been started. She would reach California for repairs towards the end of December. St. Louis would earn 11 battle stars for her service in WWII. After the war, the ship was sold to the Brazilian Navy and sunk in 1980 while being towed to the scrap yard. USS Helena, CL-50, moored in Pearl Harbor when the base came under attack by Japanese carrier planes. She was mistaken for a battleship and targeted by Japanese torpedo bombers. A torpedo passed underneath Oglala and hit Helena amidships on the starboard side. The blast tore a hole in the hull that flooded the starboard engine and boiler rooms and severed wiring for the main and secondary guns. The ship's crew raced to their battle stations, and 2 minutes after the torpedo hit, the backup forward diesel generator had been turned on, restoring power to the guns. Oglala was less fortunate than Helena, as the blast effect loosened hull plates on the mine layer and caused her to capsize. As Helena's anti-aircraft guns got into action, they helped to fend off further attacks from the second strike wave, while other men worked to control flooding by closing the many watertight hatches in the ship. 2 days after the attack, Helena was moved into Dry Dock No. 2 in Pearl Harbor for an inspection and temporary repairs. Steel plates were welded over the torpedo hole, and on 31 December, Helena was refloated. She got underway from Mare Island for permanent repairs and modifications on 5 January 1942. In late July 1942, she would rejoin the fleet in time for Operation Watchtower. Helena would participate in many of the surface actions around Guadalcanal, sinking several Japanese ships and destroying many enemy planes. She would emerge through the campaign with negligible shell damage, which killed 1 man. On 6 July 1943, Helena was operating as part of TF-68, which was engaging 10 Japanese destroyers that were attempting to resupply garrison troops at Kula Gulf. At 01:57, the Americans opened up with radar-directed fire, quickly sinking several enemy destroyers. As the American ships turned to engage a second group of destroyers at 02:03, Helena was hit on the port side below the forwardmost turret, which caused a major explosion. The blast destroyed the No. 1 turret, tore open the hull almost to the keel, and severed the bow from the rest of the hull. The rest of the hull began to flood as the force of the blast collapsed bulkheads below turret No. 2. But even after the severe damage inflicted by the first torpedo, the aft main guns continued to fire, and the ship had not yet been fatally damaged. 2 minutes after the first torpedo hit, the second and third torpedoes struck the ship in quick succession, much lower in the hull than the first had hit, as much as 15 ft below the waterline. This was below where the ship's belt armor might have reduced the scale of damage inflicted. These hit further aft in the machinery spaces, breaking the keel, flooding the forward engine and boiler rooms, and breaching bulkheads that allowed water into the aft engine room. The flooding disabled the ship's engines and left her immobilized and without electrical power. Another gaping hole had been blasted into the hull, which exacerbated the flooding caused by the first hit. It quickly became clear that Helena would not be able to survive. 2 minutes after the third hit, the captain gave the order to abandon ship. With the keel having been broken by the second and third hit, the girders that supported the hull structure began to buckle, collapsing the entire structure amidships and breaking the hull in half. The center third of the ship quickly sank, but the bow and stern remained afloat for some time before flooding caused them both to point upward as they filled with water. During the chaos of battle, it had not been known that Helena was hit and sinking by the other ships in her task force. At 02:30, it was quickly realized that Helena was not responding to radio messages, and ships began to search for the missing cruiser. At 03:13, Radford's radar picked up a contact some 5,000 yards away and confirmed it was Helena's bow pointing up out of the water. Nearly 1,000 men were in the water, clinging to life rafts and waiting to be picked up by the destroyers, which reached the men at 03:41. In the course of the night's operations, Nicholas had picked up 291, while Radford had rescued 444. A significant number of men were still in the water. Some life rafts remained in the area, while a number of men had climbed onto the still floating bow or clung to pieces of floating wreckage. Other groups of men were pulled there by the current. As the men reached the coral reef that surrounded the island on 8 July, they were met by